Wow. This is what happens when you reformat your show and keep the same theme music. This is awesome. Well, everybody, this is The Pursuit with Lucas Caylor. I am your host, Lucas Caylor, and I hope you enjoy the show. Got a new format. Fun, exciting, not really. Same old stuff, just a new name. And in this episode, we're going to get right to it. Fade the music out. This interview this week, or on this edition of The Pursuit, is with Bob Varsha. He was very generous to give his time to this program, and I want to thank him for that. Before I even run the interview, it was a lot of fun. We talked about his career. We talked about Formula E, a little bit about kart, a little bit about the Indy 500, and it was a lot of fun. So I hope you enjoy the interview, and we're going to jump right into it. So this is the interview with Bob Varsha on The Pursuit with Lucas Caylor. Well, he's been the voice of, several motor racing series over the last several decades, and now he's doing the world feed for Formula E. Welcome to the program, Bob Varsha. Bob, thanks for being on.
My pleasure, Lucas. Good to be with you.
Awesome, thank you. And I asked you off the air, but I want to ask again, how are things going with Formula E?
In a word, spectacular. Granted, consider the source coming from me, but in the 2 years that I've been on site with the crew, I basically hosted the shows on Fox since the beginning, but that was from the studio, and I would simply throw to the world feed that I am now a part of. So I've been there since the very beginning. I've seen it grow. It's phenomenal. I mean, guys like you and your audience who follow motorsports, follow the automobile industry, know that the manufacturers are just piling into this series. We're going to run out of privateer teams for these manufacturers to associate with because there's limited team space in the pit lane. But with Porsche and Mercedes coming to join Audi, and Renault's going to hand over their brand to Nissan, their sister company. It's just spectacular, fun to be a part of. I'd like to know where the big three, where the American automakers, because they're certainly pouring money into electric vehicles. But we haven't seen a sniff of an American-based automaker, and I hope it happens soon. But we're having a great time. The action's terrific. We've got a great championship fight going to the season-ending doubleheader in New York in a few weeks, and I'm really looking forward to coming back home from Europe and giving my fellow Americans a taste of Formula E.
I was going to say, talk about the growth and the potential interest in the series here in the United States. Again, you asked where the big three were. But the fan base is growing here, and just talk about how enthusiastic it must be to be a part of the growth of the series.
Well, it is, because Formula E has something to offer that a lot of the more traditional forms of motorsports have, and that is, they're new, they're fresh, they can be anything they want to be, and they're trying to appeal to that new audience segment, the young people coming up that don't seem to be flocking in great numbers to our traditional favorites from IndyCar and NASCAR and IMSA and drag racing and so forth. So it's kind of like having a completely blank canvas to paint on. And I think Alejandro Agag, who founded and is the CEO of the series, and he and his team have done a great job to make it affordable, to allow small teams to compete with the big manufacturer teams. If you just look at what happened this year, I mean, the only privateer team remaining in the series, Techeetah, is using a powertrain bought from the factory Renault team, and they're wiping up the floor with everybody. It's been spectacular to watch, and anybody can win in this sport. It's colorful. It has a lot to offer, both on and off the track. Clearly, electric vehicles are the wave of the future. That doesn't mean the internal combustion engine is going to go away. The engineering that has carried the automobile industry this far, in time, will make ICEs, as they're known, more efficient. They'll get more mileage out of the cars. I mean, heck, look what Formula One and the World Endurance Championship are doing with hybrid vehicles. They're going faster than they ever have with a third less fuel than they've had in the past. So, it's like going to the moon. You just throw this technical challenge out there in front of the teams, and there may be some belly aching, but then they look at the project and they do what engineers do, which is find solutions. And I'd like to think Formula E is leading the way in that regard. Many countries around the world are literally banning the future use of internal combustion engines. Look at China, look at Norway, look at France, look at Germany. And so electric propulsion is the way to go. And you're either going to get on the train or you're going to be thrown from it at some point.
Talk about this past weekend's event in Switzerland. The story behind it, very interesting. The first first auto racing event in Switzerland since 1955, I believe. How did that come to be, and how was it to be a part of?
Well, actually, since '54, when the last Swiss Grand Prix was held at the Bremgarten circuit, which was just horrifying place. If you go on the internet or on one of the iRacing games and run the Bremgarten circuit, you'll know what I mean. In 1955, in June of that year, the Le Mans 24 Hours suffered the most costly accident in racing history. More than 80 people were killed, including driver Pierre Levay, when he tangled with another car and flipped off the racetrack and hit a concrete abutment. And these cars that were mostly magnesium with witch's brew fuel in the tank just exploded in shrapnel that sighed through the crowd and killed more than 80 people, including Levay. Many countries around the world banned auto racing at that time. Many manufacturers pulled out, Mercedes for one. And that situation went on for years. They still ran hill climbs in Switzerland, which had banned the sport, but they did not allow circuit racing of any kind. Now, they had a Swiss Grand Prix, but they held it in France. But basically, auto racing was finished in Switzerland. Then a few years ago, a forward-looking Swiss lawmaker looking at the prospect of Formula E and the future of the automobile industry, both in Europe and around the world, came up with the idea to lift that motor racing ban if the cars were A, state-of-the-art safe, and B, totally non-polluting, emissions-free, alternative energy, if you will. So that opened the door for Formula E, and lo and behold, here in 2018, they were able to bring circuit racing back to Switzerland in a beautiful environment in Zurich. Zurich wasn't the original choice for that race. It was going to be at Lugano. But as you can imagine, setting up and tearing down a proper state-of-the-art racing circuit is an expensive proposition, and the operatives in Lugano weren't able to come up with the necessary budget to fund the race. But Zurich was able to, no doubt in part, at least, because several of the key FIA Formula E sponsors are actually based in Zurich, those being ABB, the big industrial company, Julius Baer, financial institution, Modis, which is a job placement for IT and engineering professionals. And I'm forgetting one. Tag Heuer, which is a technical partner for the team and does the timing and scoring. So those four big companies, all based in Zurich, got together and helped make this race a reality. And I have to say, it's really one of the best events I've been a part of, and that's a pretty high bar in ABB FIA Formula E. But this lakeside circuit was just the right length, just challenging enough, and it produced a terrific race. So I hope we'll be going back to Zurich for a long time to come. These are not the easiest races to do. There was one race in Miami that was far too expensive to be sustained, so that went away. They've tried Long Beach in the United States. I'm not sure why that went away, frankly. I thought that was a marriage made in heaven. But these other races around the world either succeed spectacularly or are not repeated, and there's lots of good reasons for that.
Right. Well, switching gears, I wanted to talk a bit about your career because it is interesting. And I wanted to talk about sort of the beginnings of it. You started working with WTBS Channel 17, which, by the way, the last person I interviewed on this show also worked for TBS, wrestling announcer Scott Hudson, so kind of a connection there. But,
no kidding.
Yeah, and so you worked for Channel 17. How did that deal come together? Had you had broadcasting experience before, and what exactly did they bring you in for?
Lucas, I had no broadcasting experience whatsoever. I get contacted from time to time by by young people coming out of film and television and journalism programs saying, okay, got my degree. Now, how do I get a job in TV? And I have to tell them I have no idea because my job found me. I trained as a lawyer. I went to Emory University Law School in Atlanta. I was also a runner in college. And after graduating from college and coming south to go to Emory, I fell in with a ragtag bunch of runners while running was on the ascendancy, and had a good bit of success. I wound up directing the Atlanta Track Club, and they have a key event every year called the Atlanta Journal-Constitution Peachtree Road Race. We get about 65,000 people running a 10K down the main drag of Atlanta on July 4th.
Oh, I am familiar with it. Yeah, I'm from Dalton, so I'm familiar.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So you know all about the Peachtree then.
Oh, yeah.
It's a great event. I had a lot of fun working on it. But I was back, practicing law, and all of a sudden I get a phone call from the folks at TBS saying, well, we want to televise the race this year, and we need somebody who knows the inner workings of the race, which you do, having organized the race for a few years. So will you do the TV program with us? And I said, sure. So I did the broadcast with Bob Neal and some other folks, and we shook hands and walked away at the end of the day, and I thought that was the end of it. But about 6 weeks later, they called me back again and said, hey, would you like to audition for a job part-time to start? And I said, okay, fine. So I went down and I tried out. I got the job. The next thing I knew, I was reading news blurbs in the commercial breaks during the overnight movies, which was not a sustainable situation considering my law practice. But along came something that was called CNN2, which became CNN Headline, and the rest was history. So I went over there, started working with them more and more often. CNN radio at the time was a big deal. So I got all this intense re-education, if you will, in the workings of television. Turner at that time was a non-union shop, so I could do just about anything up to and including running a TV camera, which fortunately I never did. But, I could edit my own stuff. I learned the nuances of what it takes to shoot a piece from in front of the camera in terms of angles and where you need to pause and the cadence and rhythm of your speaking and so forth. So all of this information came to me on the job. I gravitated eventually over to CNN in the sports department, which was a breeding ground for so many terrific talent in that day. There were guys like Keith Olbermann and Dan Patrick and Kathleen Sullivan, and local guys like Dennis Dumbler and Keith Van Horn and all of these guys who and girls who went on to bigger and better things. Fred Hickman, Nick Charles. Poor Nick Charles no longer with us, but it was a really exciting place to be with all these people, run by a guy named Bill McPhail. Lee is his brother. Bill, from the famous McPhail family that ran the American League and was involved in network television in the heyday of TV sports. Bill had been everywhere, done everything: Final Four, Super Bowl, World Series, Stanley Cup, on and on and on, you name it. And he had a very, very grandfatherly, comfortable way of leading people, including firing people and still making them think that they were the greatest thing since sliced bread. And after a few years there, that's exactly what happened to me. I went to lunch with Bill McPhail, and he left me without a job, but secure in the knowledge that I had a future in the business, which I'll always be grateful for. So anyway, while I was at Turner, along came World Sports Enterprises, an independent production company built by Ken Squire, who's currently the only journalist in the NASCAR Hall of Fame for all of his great work with CBS over the years, and his partner, Fred Reinstein, who was a real pioneer in the TV news business with NBC, doing Vietnam, the space program, the Kennedy assassination. Fred was a part of presenting and documenting all of these seminal moments from the middle part of the 20th century. And together they had come up with this idea for a motorsports news program, essentially, 30-minute show called Motor Week Illustrated. You're probably not old enough to remember that, but it was hosted by a guy named Dave Despain. Mm-hmm. Ken would make occasional appearances, but they needed a guy who could come in at the last minute and do an update. They shot what we call a donut. They would shoot the bulk of the show on a Wednesday when the studio was cheap. And obviously stuff happens between Wednesday and Saturday, and the show would air on Sunday. So they need somebody to come in and talk about, qualifying for the events that weekend or any news that happened, and they would leave a hole in the middle of the show for this to be inserted.
Right.
So I auditioned for that job and got it. So suddenly, with no background whatsoever in motorsports, I was the TV guy for the Motor Week Illustrated update. And one thing led to another. I began to hit the road to do events with World Sports. They sent me off to do video news releases from the IMSA Camel GT sports car races. And while I was there, I met the guys from another very young company, ESPN,
right,
who said, "Hey, you're around here all the time. How would you like to host some of our shows?" And I said, "Sure." So off I went, and that's kind of my career in a nutshell. The job came out of nowhere. I was able to make the most of the opportunity, and there was plenty of opportunity in those days as cable television, thanks to Ted Turner, was becoming huge. There was this massive demand for content, and it was fairly easy for me to just go off in this direction or that direction. People ask me from time to time, do I regret the time and money and effort that I spent earning a law degree and practicing law when my eventual career would wind up in sports broadcasting? And I say no, because the skills are very similar, I think. Presenting a story for television, storytelling, if you will, is a lot like advocacy in the law. I mean, you're telling a story with a certain perspective. So I think that, and the research techniques I used and the use of language and vocabulary and so forth, all kind of just smoothed the road between practicing law and sliding into this television role. I've been very lucky. My career portfolio, if you will, includes a lot of sports besides motorsports. I've covered ski jumping and figure skating and alpine ski racing and all sorts of motorsports, track and field, gymnastics, swimming. Heck, I've even done shooting and equestrian, and I barely know one end of the horse from the other. But my job really doesn't change. As a play-by-play guy, I just need to get us on the air, tell people where we are, who the stars are, why it's important. But when the action begins, I don't need to be the expert in whatever the sport is I'm covering. I've got an expert commentator next to me, usually a blue chip athlete of some kind, and they know what they're looking at. And it's their job to tell us whether it's good, bad, or otherwise. So, as I say, it's easy for me to slide from sport to sport. I kind of miss those days because I've been mostly motorsports oriented for the last 10 or 15 years, but it's been a great ride, and if it all ended tomorrow, which I hope it doesn't, I wouldn't regret a minute of it.
One thing about your career with, excuse me, with ESPN, I wanted to ask about, because it is the 10th anniversary year of the reunification, the 96 US 500. I want to talk about what was the attitude going into that day, and what was the general attitude after the incident before the start?
Well, there was a lot of bad feeling when Tony George created the Indy Racing League. Truth be told, what he wound up with when all of the top teams from the kart days decided they weren't going to bend a knee to Tony's will. There were a lot of headstrong people involved. I mean, we see it over and over again in every walk of life. The very successful people are used to getting their way. And what you often wind up with is what we used to describe as a kindergarten full of millionaires. Nobody would give in on any issue. And so CART, which became Champ Car, and the IRL went their separate ways. The Indy 500 suffered terribly. Tony was going to limit the field to his IRL guys. And so the feeling at CART or Champ Car back then was, well, screw them. We'll do our own thing, and we'll do a bigger and better thing than he's doing, and we'll make it look just like the Indy 500, but we'll do it at Michigan, call it the US 500, put up $1 million to win, and away we go. And somebody overlooked the fact that instead of running on the flat 2.5-mile Indianapolis four-cornered oval track, they were running the D-shaped 2-mile Michigan,
right, which
has high banks on it. So they decided we'll go 3 wide 2 at the start. And on those high banks, when you're coming up to 200 plus miles an hour, that's a very, very tricky proposition. So of course we had the big accident at the start, didn't get the race off to a green flag start, which was very, very disappointing. We had a good race in the end, but it was a one-time only event because I think everybody realized what was being sacrificed here. It's funny because the two competing networks were ABC, who had the 500, and ESPN, who had the US 500. And these became sister companies when they were both acquired by Capital Cities Corporation. So basically, there was a sibling rivalry, if you will. I had been covering Champ Car with Danny Sullivan as my booth mate. Danny was contracted to go over and do the Indy 500 with ABC. So Scott Goodyear, I think, maybe made his debut at the US 500 with me in the booth. And Danny told me later that he and Paul Page and the guys who were working on Indianapolis had a TV monitor set down low on the floor covering our race because we were starting slightly before them. And so they're on the air and they're talking about what's going to happen. And here we are at Indy and everything. And Danny looks down and he sees this big crash starting the US 500. And he almost shouted out on the air, "Oh, there's a crash," which would have been hilarious.
Yeah.
Might not have been so hilarious at the time, but it is to think about now. So we laugh about that from time to time. So that's how it all came about. And that's how it went away when, the handwriting on the wall in terms of how badly both series would be hurt by being two series instead of one.
I was going to ask, do you think that the crash at the start had an impact on CART and the future of both series, really?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. At the start, when they first split, the IRL used basically the same mechanical formula as CART, as the Champ Car teams did. So you were basically looking at two sides of the same coin when you watched one race or the other. The difference, or one of the differences, was that in CART, you had all of these big name drivers. You had the Emerson Fittipaldis and the Al Unser Juniors and the Paul Tracys and the Jimmy Vassars and the Alex Zanardis and all that. The Indianapolis field on a talent basis was, I think it's fair to say, a good bit inferior to what CART and the Champ Car teams offered. But Tony George had the ultimate weapon, or hammer, as he said at the time. He had the Indianapolis 500, which, of course, has a history and a legacy like no other race. And that eventually was what I think led to the end of Champ Car and the reunification of championship car racing in the United States was the strength of the Indy 500, which was where all the teams and drivers wanted to be, regardless of where their corporate allegiance lay. It's funny. I had a chat years later with Tom Anderson, who went to work for Michael Andretti when Michael formed his team. Tom has a long history in the sport and a very successful one, glittering resume. And I asked him what he thought of the split. This was shortly after the reunification, and he says, well, I'll tell you what I think. And that is that when there was a split, people had choice, and you had a total of, I forget the number. It was, like 40 or 50 individual teams, and all of those teams had staff, they had employees, they had payrolls. So when the teams merged, when the two series merged, and suddenly teams began to disappear because they just couldn't compete with the high dollar operations coming in from CART into, the Indy Racing League, or IndyCar as it subsequently came to be called, that put a lot of people out of work, and it kind of narrowed the entryway, if you will. It sort of closed the door on the potential for a lot of young, not just drivers, but mechanics and engineers and truckies and on and on and on. And it really affected the economy of the business of open wheel motorsports at the highest level in the United States. And people don't often talk about that, but I remember to the folks on the inside, that was a big deal. Maybe they didn't want the two series to get together simply because it would have such a severe impact on the job situation, and everybody involved loved racing so much. The idea of losing your gig was not a pleasant one.
Right. Well, moving ahead to more recent times, I wanted to ask. Of course, ABC broadcast their final Indianapolis 500 a few weeks ago.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think as far as what it means to broadcasting and sports broadcasting? How did you feel about that coming to an end? I mean, 54 years and a very strong legacy. A lot of broadcast innovation came from that partnership. How did you feel about it ending? I mean, you played a small
Yeah.
part in the history of, ESPN and ABC's broadcasting of IndyCar.
Mm-hmm.
So, was there any emotion tied to that?
Oh, absolutely. I say I came into motorsports with no background in it as a, 30-year-old, I guess. Um, but I love it, and I know a great deal about it now, and I know a lot of the people involved in it now. So change is hard for everyone, and being not only a part of the motorsports scene, but being a TV guy and knowing the ins and outs of that industry and the politics and so on. I have to admit I was a little bit sad to see the end of the relationship between ABC and the Indy 500 because, as you say, it had gone on for so long. Jim McKay, who hosted it for so many years, was one of my personal heroes once I get into the broadcasting business. And I had worked with Jackie Stewart in Monaco back around 1990, 91. And so, it's a small family professionally when you get right down to it. A lot of people, we all know each other. And I know for Alan and Eddie and Scott and Rick DeBrule and Doc and Lindsay and Jamie and all the people in the pit lane, it's a sad thing. I mean, they'll all be fine, but there comes a time for everyone. I mean, look at Paul Page, who was the voice of this great sport for so long on the Champ Car side. That the time appears to have come for him to sort of go off and enjoy his retirement, and I hope he does. And it will come for me. I'm not as busy as I once was. These things are changing all the time. It's funny you mentioned ABC and the Indy 500. Roone Arledge, who was the guy who led ABC Sports to a preeminent place from really out of nowhere in the TV business, wrote a book just before he died called Roone, Roone, and I recommend it. He gives you a real insight into the big dollar, cost is no object world of both news and sports as they tried to build a network that people would watch. A lot of funny stories, a lot of heartbreaking stories along the way. But back when cable came along and ESPN was the upstart and both companies were acquired by Cap Cities, the folks at ABC Sports considered themselves elite, and justifiably so. I mean, they had basically invented sports television as we knew it in that day. And along came these ESPN folks, including yours truly, who were doing things on a budget and who were doing 24 hours of sports a day, and not just, we all need to be reminded, not just for a couple of hours on the weekends. This was sports as big time TV content. So ABC begrudgingly, they were told, okay, ESPN is here. We're going to move a lot of your projects over to the ESPN side because that's where sports should be in our business plan. But ABC Sports didn't want to do that. They didn't want to turn over the Indy 500, the Kentucky Derby back then, the Monaco Grand Prix. They wanted to keep these things, and they did. I had worked for ESPN on Formula One for a number of years, all except for one race, which was the Monaco Grand Prix. And then one year, Keith Jackson, who had normally called it each year for ABC Sports, was hospitalized and couldn't make the race. They needed someone to work alongside Jackie Stewart and my old buddy John Bisignano and at Monaco. And they said, will you do it? And I said, let me think about it. Yes, of course I'll do it. And so that was my ABC Sports debut. But, back then it was, who are you, kid? Basically ABC Sports talking to ESPN. So gradually, those lines were erased, and now I think network television and cable are probably seen in the same frame of reference by the average fan, and that's a good thing, I think.
Well, speaking of cable, moving on to this weekend, of course, the 24 hours at Le Mans, the debut of the race on Velocity. What are we going to expect this weekend at Le Mans, you think?
Well, it'll be another great Le Mans, I must say, which is my favorite race in the world. I had hoped to be a part of somebody's broadcast this weekend, but it doesn't look like that's going to happen. But I mean, it's just the most amazing spectacle. I'm not going to compare it to the Indy 500 or the Daytona 500 or whatever. It is, one of the last surviving true road races in the sense of public roads, not purpose-built racetrack. You have Bathurst in Australia, and right off the top of my head right now, I can't think of another one. But at Le Mans, they leave the property of the ACO, the Bugatti circuit, and they go off on the public roads and rocket through the night down the Mulsanne, and it is just the most mesmerizing event. The color, the noise, the speeds, the technology, it's just fabulous. And I'm sure that Velocity and the Discovery Networks will put on a great show. They're actually using one of their sister networks, which is Eurosport over here in Europe. They're going to use their broadcast. So it'll be a great job, and it'll be a lot of fun to watch. And I'm sure I'm going to watch every minute of it that I can here in Paris.
Well, Bob, we're just about out of time. Go ahead.
Oh, I will venture one prediction.
All right.
Toyota is going to win it at long last after so many heartbreaking years, and I wouldn't be a bit surprised if Formula One star Fernando Alonso was not in the winning car.
Okay.
No, let me change that. Let me self-edit.
Okay.
I will be surprised if he's not in the winning car. They are so pleased to have Alonso. I think they're going to do everything in their power to make sure that he is on the winning driver team. But having said that, I mean, the Toyota hybrids are clearly the class of the field, spectacular as it is. So I expect them to win. We'll see what happens.
All right. Well, like I said a moment ago, we're just about out of time. Bob, thanks for doing this. Come back on sometime.
Oh, my pleasure, Lucas. I'm never short of words.
All right. Bob Varsha, everybody, thank you for coming on again. Well, there you have it. Bob Varsha, everybody. That was a fun interview, wasn't it? Good times. Well, I'd like to thank you for listening to The Pursuit. I'd also like to thank my friend Jonathan out in Texas for the theme music. I don't think he knows I'm using it yet. So we'll find out. He made this for me kind of as a private thing. And I'm using it because it's good. So we'll see what he says when he finds out I'm using it, huh? Anyway, it's been fun, but I gotta go. I got stuff to do. I have a day job, a zoo to work at, things to do. Until next time, everybody, stay rad. I'm Lucas Caylor. You've been listening to The Pursuit.